What if I told you that the money in your pocket isn't really worth anything, that the numbers in your bank account are just numbers, digital ghosts of a promise that was broken decades ago? Every day, billions of people wake up and trade their time, their energy, their very lives for pieces of paper. They work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. They sacrifice time with their families. They endure stress, exhaustion, and burnout. All for what? For currency that governments can create out of thin air with a few keystrokes. But when did we agree to this arrangement? When did humanity collectively decide that our labor, our most precious non-renewable resource, should be exchanged for something that has no intrinsic value? And more importantly, who benefits from this illusion? Money only works because we believe it works. It's the greatest act of collective faith in human history. More people believe in the value of money than believe in any religion. More people trust money than trust their own governments. And yet, money is nothing more than a shared hallucination, a mass delusion that we all participate in because we have no choice. For thousands of years, humans understood this intuitively. They traded tangible things: salt, which preserved food and was essential for survival; cattle, which provided milk, labor, and meat; shells, which were rare and beautiful. These were objects you could touch, use, and consume. They had intrinsic value independent of what anyone else thought about them. But around 600 BC, something profound changed in human civilization. Gold emerged as the dominant form of money. Why gold? Because it possessed unique properties that made it the perfect store of value. Gold doesn't rust or corrode. You can bury it in the ground for 1,000 years and dig it up looking exactly the same. Gold doesn't decay. It's chemically stable and virtually indestructible under normal conditions. Gold is rare, but not too rare. There's enough of it to facilitate trade, but not so much that it becomes worthless. Gold is divisible. You can melt it down and reform it without losing value. Gold is portable relative to its value. A small amount of gold represents significant wealth. And perhaps most importantly, gold cannot be created from thin air. You can't print gold. You can't legislate it into existence. Every ounce of gold that exists had to be physically extracted from the earth through labor and energy. This made gold honest money. It couldn't be manipulated or inflated away by kings or governments. For over 2,500 years, gold was money. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires conquered and collapsed. But gold remained valuable. The ancient Lydians minted the first gold coins. The Romans built an empire on gold currency. Medieval kingdoms stored their wealth in gold. But gold had practical problems. It was heavy and difficult to transport large quantities safely. A significant amount of gold required armed guards and secure transport. It was also difficult to make small change. How do you split a gold coin to buy a loaf of bread? These practical limitations created an opportunity for innovation and for deception. Medieval goldsmiths offered a solution that seemed brilliant at the time. They had vaults, strong rooms where they stored gold for their jewelry work. They offered to store gold for merchants and wealthy individuals. In return for depositing your gold, the goldsmith would give you a paper receipt. This receipt could be redeemed for your gold at any time. But here's where it got interesting. People discovered they could trade the receipts instead of trading the actual gold. If you wanted to buy something expensive, instead of transporting heavy gold, you just handed over the paper receipt. The seller could then go to the goldsmith and exchange it for gold, or more conveniently, just accept the paper and use it for their own transactions. This was the birth of paper money. But here's the critical part that most people forget. Every piece of paper represented real gold sitting in a vault somewhere. The paper was just convenient, a claim check for something tangible and real. The goldsmiths noticed something else. Most people never came to redeem their gold. The paper circulated as money while the gold sat untouched in the vault. So the goldsmiths started issuing more receipts than they had gold to back them. They'd lend out paper receipts and charge interest, even though the gold supposedly backing those receipts was already backing other receipts. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, a practice that continues today. As long as everyone didn't demand their gold at the same time, the system worked. But when trust failed, when rumors spread, everyone would rush to the goldsmith demanding their gold. These were called bank runs, and they exposed the fundamental fraud. There wasn't enough gold for all the paper. By the 1800s, most developed nations had formalized this system into what was called the gold standard. Governments issued paper currency, but by law, this currency was convertible to gold at a fixed rate. In the United States, the gold standard meant that if you had a $20 bill, you could walk into any bank in America and exchange it for exactly 1 ounce of gold. No questions asked, no waiting period, no restrictions. The gold was yours by right. This system had a built-in limit that governments hated but citizens loved. Governments couldn't just print unlimited money because every dollar needed gold backing. If you printed more paper than you had gold, people would simply exchange the paper for gold, and your gold reserves would vanish. This created discipline, it created restraint. It meant that government spending was limited by reality, not by political promises. Politicians couldn't promise unlimited benefits to voters because there wasn't unlimited money. Wars had to be paid for with taxes or gold, not just printed currency. The gold standard was like a strict parent watching over government finances, preventing the worst excesses. It also meant that money represented something tangible, something that required labor and energy to extract from the earth. When you earned money, you were earning a claim on real wealth. Your savings held their value because the money supply couldn't be arbitrarily increased. Inflation was minimal and often reversed by deflation. The purchasing power of money was relatively stable over time, but then came World War I and everything changed. War is expensive, incredibly expensive. Bullets, artillery shells, rifles, machine guns, tanks, airplanes, uniforms, food, medical supplies. The list goes on endlessly. Soldiers need to be paid. Their families need support if they die. Entire economies have to be reorganized for war production. And all of this costs money, far more money than any government had in their treasuries. Countries needed to spend beyond their means. They needed more money than their gold reserves allowed. The gold standard was an obstacle to total war, so one by one nations made a fateful decision. They temporarily suspended the gold standard to print money for the war effort. Temporary. That's what they promised their citizens. Just during the emergency. Just until the war is over. Then we'll return to sound money. Trust us. Germany provides the most dramatic example of what happens when this promise is broken. After losing World War I, Germany owed massive reparations to the Allied powers. The debt was denominated in gold marks, but Germany had no gold left. The war had drained everything. So the German government did what governments always do when faced with debts they cannot pay. They printed money. The Reichsbank printing presses ran day and night. At first it seemed manageable. Prices rose, but slowly. Then the acceleration began. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the German currency. Prices doubled every few days. Workers demanded to be paid twice per day, so they could spend the money before it became worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows and baskets. There are famous photographs of children playing with stacks of bills like building blocks because the paper was literally worthless. It took 4 trillion marks to buy a single US dollar. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. This wasn't just an economic catastrophe. It was a social and political catastrophe. The middle class, the backbone of German society, was wiped out. People who had saved for decades found their entire life savings couldn't buy a single meal. Pensions became worthless. Insurance policies, bonds, anything denominated in marks became trash. The psychological trauma was profound. People lost faith in government, in money, in the entire system. This created the conditions for extremism. When people have nothing left to lose, when the system has failed them completely, they become willing to follow anyone who promises to restore order and dignity. The hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic is often cited as one of the factors that led to the rise of the Nazi Party. This is what happens when money loses its anchor to reality. When the illusion is exposed, when faith collapses, society itself can collapse. The Great Depression of 1929 shook the world to its very foundations. It began with a stock market crash in October, but it metastasized into something far worse. Banks failed by the thousands. In the United States alone, over 9,000 banks collapsed between 1930 and 1933. When a bank failed, depositors lost everything. There was no FDIC insurance, no government guarantee. Your life savings simply vanished. Businesses collapsed because they couldn't get credit. Unemployment reached 25% in America, higher in some other countries. 13 million Americans were out of work. Families lost their homes. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprang up in every major city, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover. The psychological impact was devastating. Suicide rates increased, birth rates dropped. An entire generation was scarred by the experience. The Depression revealed the fragility of the financial system. It exposed how interconnected everything had become. When American banks failed, it triggered failures in Europe. When European countries couldn't repay their debts, it hurt American banks more. International trade collapsed by over 60%. Countries desperately tried to protect their own economies by raising tariffs and devaluing their currencies. This beggar-thy-neighbor policy made everything worse. If every country devalues their currency to boost exports, no one actually gains an advantage, and global trade dies. The world economy spiraled downward for years. It took World War II and the massive government spending that came with it to finally pull most countries out of the Depression. But the economic devastation left scars and lessons that leaders claimed they would never forget. From the ashes of this economic catastrophe, world leaders knew they needed to create a new international monetary order, something to prevent this level of chaos from happening again, something to facilitate trade and prevent the competitive devaluations that had made the Depression worse. Or at least, that was the official story. The real motivations were more complex, more political, and more self-interested than the public history books typically acknowledge. By 1944, it was clear that the Allies would win World War II. The question was no longer if, but when. And the major powers were already thinking about the post-war world. Who would dominate economically? What would the new international system look like? How could the victors ensure their continued power? July 1944. The war in Europe still had almost a year to go. The Pacific War would continue for another 14 months. But in the quiet mountains of New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. Over 3 weeks, they would redesign the global financial system. The conference was officially about creating stability, preventing another depression, and facilitating post-war reconstruction. Noble goals that everyone could support publicly. But beneath the surface, this was about power, economic power, political power, the power to shape the world for the next half-century. The United States came to Bretton Woods from a position of overwhelming strength. While Europe and Asia had been devastated by years of warfare, America's mainland was untouched. No bombs had fallen on American cities. No tanks had rolled through American streets. American factories were intact and running at full capacity, producing goods for the war effort and for post-war reconstruction. American agriculture was feeding not just America, but much of the Allied world. And most importantly, the United States held over 60% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Fort Knox was full. European treasuries were empty. They had spent their gold buying weapons and food from America. The British Empire, once the dominant global power, was effectively bankrupt. Britain owed massive debts to America. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was weak and getting weaker. America's chief negotiator at Bretton Woods was Harry Dexter White, a senior Treasury official. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most famous economist in the world at the time. These two men, representing the declining empire and the rising superpower, shaped the new system. Keynes had a more ambitious plan. He proposed creating an international currency called the Bancor, which would be used for all international trade. No single nation's currency would be privileged. It was elegant and fair. It also would have prevented America from gaining monetary dominance. Naturally, America rejected it. White had a different vision, a vision where the dollar would be at the center of the global economy. Here's what they finally agreed to. The United States dollar would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This gave the dollar credibility and linked it to the gold standard that people still trusted. But here's the crucial twist that most people miss. Regular people, businesses, even foreign governments couldn't actually exchange their dollars for gold. Only foreign central banks could request gold from the US Treasury. This was a critical limitation. It meant that while the dollar was theoretically backed by gold, in practice most dollar holders could never test that claim. They had to simply trust that the gold was there and that the US would honor its commitment. Every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The British pound was set at $4.03 per pound, the French franc at $0.084 per franc. The Japanese yen would later be pegged at 360 yen per dollar. Every currency defined in terms of dollars, and the dollar was defined in terms of gold. The dollar became the intermediary, the universal translator between all currencies. If a German company wanted to trade with a Japanese company, they would convert marks to dollars, then dollars to yen. The dollar was now the world's currency. The system also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions that would become powerful tools of American foreign policy in the decades to come. This was brilliant from America's perspective. International trade, which had collapsed during the Depression and war, would now flow through dollars. Oil, wheat, steel, everything priced in dollars. If you wanted to do business globally, you needed dollars. This created permanent demand for American currency. It allowed America to run trade deficits without facing the consequences that would destroy other countries' currencies. If France ran a big trade deficit, the franc would collapse. But if America ran a deficit, it just meant more dollars circulating globally, which was fine because the world needed dollars for trade. This is what de Gaulle would later call America's exorbitant privilege. The ability to print the world's reserve currency is the ultimate form of economic power. For about 2 decades, the Bretton Woods system worked remarkably well. The global economy grew rapidly. International trade expanded. Europe and Japan rebuilt from the devastation of war. The American middle class flourished. Suburbs sprawled across the country. A single working man could support a family, buy a house, own a car. The promise of capitalism seemed to be delivering prosperity. The dollar was as good as gold, everyone said. Trust us, we have the gold. Fort Knox is full, your dollars are safe. But beneath this prosperous surface, cracks were forming. Cracks that would eventually shatter the entire system. The Vietnam War began to escalate in the mid-1960s. What started as a small advisory mission became a massive military commitment. At the peak, over 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. The war cost billions of dollars every month. Bombs, bullets, helicopters, Agent Orange, napalm, military pay, veterans' benefits, the expenses were staggering. Simultaneously, President Lyndon Johnson was implementing his Great Society programs. Medicare and Medicaid were created, providing health care to the elderly and poor. The War on Poverty launched numerous social programs. Federal spending on education increased dramatically. These were noble goals, attempting to address real social problems. But they were expensive, very expensive. The United States was fighting 2 wars simultaneously, a war in Vietnam and a war on poverty at home. Both required massive government spending, but the government had a problem. Tax revenues weren't sufficient to cover all this spending. The traditional solution would be to either raise taxes or cut spending elsewhere. Both options were politically unpopular. So the government chose a third option, an option that would seem costless in the short term, but would have catastrophic consequences in the long term. They started printing money, not literally printing physical bills at first, but creating money through the banking system. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply. More dollars were flowing into the economy and out into the world. At first, this seemed harmless. Inflation was low, the economy was growing, everything seemed fine. But there was a fundamental problem that couldn't be ignored forever. The gold reserves at Fort Knox were not growing. Gold is a physical commodity. You can't create it from nothing. While the number of dollars was increasing rapidly, the amount of gold backing those dollars remained relatively constant. The ratio between dollars and gold was getting worse every year. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars circulating globally than there was gold to back them up. The math was becoming impossible to hide. If even a fraction of dollar holders demanded their gold, the US Treasury couldn't honor those claims. The whole system was built on a lie that was about to be exposed. France's President Charles de Gaulle was not a man who trusted easily, especially not the Americans. De Gaulle was a nationalist who believed deeply in French sovereignty and independence. He resented American dominance of the post-war order. He saw clearly that the Bretton Woods system gave America unfair advantages. While other countries had to earn dollars through trade or borrow them at interest, America could simply print them. This allowed America to buy French companies, invest in French real estate, and generally export its inflation to the rest of the world. De Gaulle called this arrangement an exorbitant privilege, and he decided to challenge it. In February 1965, de Gaulle gave a press conference that sent shockwaves through the international financial system. He argued that gold, and only gold, was real money. Paper currencies were merely claims on gold, and the current system where the dollar could be inflated at will was fundamentally unjust. He announced that France would begin converting its dollar reserves into gold. This wasn't just rhetoric. France started shipping dollars to the US Treasury and demanding gold in return. Actual physical gold bars were loaded onto ships and aircraft and transported from New York to Paris. By 1966, France had converted over $1 billion into gold. Other countries watched this carefully. If France could demand gold, why shouldn't they? Germany, historically close to the United States, was more cautious, but also concerned about the growing number of dollars in its reserves. Switzerland, always prudent about monetary matters, also began converting some dollars to gold. The trickle was becoming a stream. Gold was flowing out of Fort Knox like water through a leaking dam, and with each shipment of gold that left, the underlying weakness of the system became more apparent. The United States was hemorrhaging gold, and there was no way to stop it without either cutting spending dramatically or admitting that the dollar could no longer be backed by gold. The numbers were becoming impossible to hide. In 1950, the United States had over 20,000 tons of gold in its reserves. By 1970, this had fallen to less than 10,000 tons. Meanwhile, the number of dollars held by foreign central banks had exploded. In 1950, foreign dollar holdings were about $8 billion, comfortably backed by America's massive gold reserves. By 1970, foreign entities held over $70 billion. Simple arithmetic revealed the crisis. At $35 per ounce, the US had maybe $12 billion worth of gold, but it owed foreign central banks over $70 billion. If even 20% of foreign dollar holders demanded gold, America couldn't pay. The emperor had no clothes. Fort Knox was running dry. American policymakers faced an impossible dilemma. If they honored the Bretton Woods Agreement and continued exchanging dollars for gold, they would run out of gold completely within a few years. America would be left with no gold reserves at all, utterly humiliated on the world stage. The dollar would collapse, and with it American economic power, but the alternative was almost as bad. If they refused to honor the gold commitment, they would be breaking the fundamental promise of Bretton Woods. They would be admitting that the system was a fraud, that the dollars everyone held were not really backed by gold after all. Either way, the game was up. Something had to give. The Nixon administration tried various tactics to delay the reckoning. They pressured allies not to request gold. They tried to negotiate new rules that would reduce pressure on American gold reserves. They considered raising the official gold price, which would effectively devalue the dollar against gold. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem couldn't be fixed by diplomacy or negotiation. There were simply too many dollars and not enough gold. The mathematics of the situation were inexorable. By the summer of 1971, the situation reached a crisis point. Gold was flowing out at an unsustainable rate. Something had to be done immediately. August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David for an emergency meeting. This wasn't on the official schedule. The secrecy was absolute. They couldn't let the markets know something big was coming. Treasury Secretary John Connolly, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and other key figures debated their options. They all knew the gold standard was finished. The only question was how to end it and how to present it to the American people and the world. They worked through the weekend, drafting speeches, planning the announcement, coordinating the response. August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening. Most Americans were relaxing, enjoying the last days of summer. Families were watching television together. No one expected what was about to happen. There had been no warning, no hints in the press. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, President Nixon interrupted regular programming to address the nation. He announced a new economic policy. He talked about inflation, about foreign competition, about protecting American jobs. The language was carefully chosen to sound reasonable, even protective of American workers. And then he dropped the bomb. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Suspend temporarily. Those were the key words, temporarily. Just for a little while, until things stabilized, until we got inflation under control, until our trading partners stopped taking advantage of us. This was presented as a temporary emergency measure, not a permanent change to the global monetary system. But anyone who understood monetary history knew the truth. Temporary suspensions of gold convertibility never end. They're always permanent. Always. It happened after World War I. Countries suspended gold convertibility temporarily and never fully went back. This was the same pattern repeating. In that one sentence, Nixon had unilaterally ended the Bretton Woods system. He had broken the promise made 27 years earlier in New Hampshire. The dollar would no longer be convertible to gold, not for foreign central banks, not for anyone. The last link between the dollar and gold was severed, and with it the last link between any major currency and gold. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar, so when the dollar left the gold standard, every currency left the gold standard. In one speech, Nixon had moved the entire world onto a pure fiat money system. Wall Street reacted with shock. This was unprecedented. Markets had expected maybe a devaluation, an increase in the gold price from $35 to perhaps $50 per ounce, but a complete suspension of gold convertibility. This was radical. The next morning, Monday, August 16th, stock markets initially rallied. Investors thought this might be good for business. Lower dollar meant better exports. But currency markets went into chaos. The carefully maintained fixed exchange rates of Bretton Woods immediately became impossible to maintain. How do you peg your currency to dollars when no one knows what dollars are worth anymore? Central banks around the world tried to maintain their pegs, but couldn't. Within weeks, most major currencies were floating against each other, their values determined by market forces rather than fixed agreements. Foreign governments were outraged, especially America's allies. The French felt vindicated but also betrayed. The Germans were shocked. The British were dismayed. They had all been holding massive amounts of dollars in their reserves, believing those dollars were as good as gold. Now they discovered they were holding paper backed by nothing but a promise from a government that had just broken its most important promise. It was theft on a grand scale. America had bought real goods, real companies, real assets from these countries with dollars. Those countries had accepted dollars because they believed they could convert them to gold. Now they were stuck holding paper that America could print unlimited quantities of. The Nixon administration tried to sell this as protecting America from unfair foreign competition. Connolly famously told worried European finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." It was an admission of how the new system would work. America would do what was best for America, and the rest of the world would have to adjust. This wasn't cooperation. This wasn't the stable international monetary system that Bretton Woods was supposed to create. This was raw power politics. America had the world's reserve currency, the world's largest economy, and the world's most powerful military. They could dictate terms. And they did. For the first time in human history, the world's reserve currency, the currency used for most international trade, was backed by absolutely nothing physical. Not gold, not silver, not anything you could hold in your hand. Just faith. Just the full faith and credit of the United States government. But what does that really mean? It means trust us. It means we promise to maintain the value of the currency. It means we won't print so much that it becomes worthless. It means exactly what every failed empire has said before its currency collapsed into nothing. It's the same promise the Romans made about the denarius as they debased it with cheaper metals. The same promise Weimar Germany made before hyperinflation. The same promise that has been broken countless times throughout history. The term for this new system is fiat money. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. It means money by decree, money because the government says so. The value comes not from intrinsic worth, not from being backed by a commodity, but from government law and the willingness of people to accept it. Fiat money's value is based entirely on confidence, on belief, on collective faith. As long as everyone believes the currency has value, it does. But if that faith breaks, if people stop believing, the currency can become worthless remarkably quickly. History is littered with the corpses of dead fiat currencies. Over 590 fiat currencies have existed throughout history. Know how many are still in use? 0 from before the 20th century. They all eventually failed, all of them. And from that moment on, the United States Federal Reserve gained a power that no institution in human history had ever possessed. The power to create the world's reserve currency from nothing, with no limit, no constraint, no natural break. Just print. Need to pay for a war. Print. Need to bail out banks. Print. Need to fund government programs. Print. The printing press, or in modern times, the digital equivalent, became the solution to every problem, and print they did. Oh, how they printed. The immediate consequence of the Nixon shock was inflation. Severe, painful, economically destructive inflation. When you suddenly increase the money supply without increasing the amount of goods and services in the economy, prices rise. It's simple supply and demand. More money chasing the same amount of goods means higher prices. The 1970s became a decade of stagflation, a horrible combination of high inflation and low economic growth. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to conventional economic theory, but it happened anyway. Reality has a way of destroying elegant theories. In 1970, before Nixon closed the gold window, inflation in the United States was around 5.7%. By 1974, it had reached 11%. By 1980, it peaked at 13.5%. Over the course of the 1970s, the dollar lost over 70% of its purchasing power. Think about what this means in practical terms. If you had saved $10,000 in 1970, by 1980 it had the purchasing power of about $3,000. 70% of your wealth, earned through labor and carefully saved, simply evaporated. Not through theft in the traditional sense, but through monetary policy, through inflation. A gallon of gasoline cost 36 cents in 1970. By 1980, it cost over $1.20. The price had more than tripled. A new house that cost $25,000 in 1970 cost $77,000 by 1980. College tuition, food, clothing, everything doubled or tripled in price. Wages did increase during this period, but not as fast as prices. The working class and middle class saw their living standards decline even as they worked harder and longer hours. Retirees were devastated. People who had carefully saved for retirement, who had pensions or bonds that paid fixed amounts, discovered their income couldn't keep up with rising costs. Many elderly Americans had to go back to work or rely on family support. The stock market suffered terribly during the 1970s. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the decade lower than it began, despite some ups and downs in between. When you account for inflation, the real returns were deeply negative. Investors lost purchasing power. Savings accounts and bonds, traditionally considered safe investments, were disasters. If you had money in a savings account earning 5% interest while inflation was 10%, you were losing 5% per year in real terms. The safe, responsible approach to money that had worked for generations was suddenly a path to impoverishment. By 1980, inflation was so out of control that the Federal Reserve, under new chairman Paul Volcker, took drastic action. Volcker raised interest rates to unprecedented levels. The federal funds rate, the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans, reached 20%. 20%. Mortgages became impossible to afford. A 30-year mortgage at 18% interest meant your monthly payment was almost entirely interest. Very little went to principal. Small businesses couldn't borrow to expand or even to maintain operations. The economy went into a severe recession. Unemployment reached over 10%. Factories closed. The Rust Belt began its long decline. But Volcker judged this pain necessary. Inflation was a disease eating away at the economy, destroying trust in money itself. The only cure was to make money expensive, to reduce the money supply, to cause a recession that would break the inflationary psychology. It worked, but at enormous cost. Millions of people lost their jobs. Families lost their homes. The social fabric frayed. The 1981-1982 recession was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. But it did break the back of inflation. By 1983, inflation had fallen back to around 3%. The dollar had been stabilized, at least temporarily. But the damage was done. An entire generation had learned that saving money was foolish. That debt was smarter than savings because you could repay loans with depreciated currency. The incentive structure of the economy had fundamentally changed. Yet something else happened during the 1970s and beyond, something more insidious and less understood by the general public. When money can be created from nothing, those closest to the source of money creation benefit first and most. This is called the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century Irish-French economist who analyzed how new money enters an economy and who benefits. The effect is simple but profound. New money doesn't spread evenly throughout the economy. It enters at specific points and flows outward from there. In the modern financial system, new money enters through the banking system and financial markets. When the Federal Reserve creates new money, it typically does so by buying government bonds from banks or by lending to banks at low interest rates. The banks receive this new money first. They can then lend it out or invest it before prices have adjusted to the increased money supply. Wealthy individuals and corporations with access to bank credit can borrow this newly created money at low interest rates. They use it to buy assets, real estate, stocks, bonds, companies, commodities. They buy these assets before the new money has filtered through the economy and raised prices. By the time the new money reaches ordinary workers in the form of wages, the prices of assets have already increased. The working class gets paid in currency that's being devalued, while the wealthy have already converted their money into assets that are appreciating. This creates a systematic transfer of wealth from those who work for wages to those who own assets and have access to credit. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. No one is meeting in a smoke-filled room planning to steal from the poor. It's simply how the system works. The structure of fiat money and fractional reserve banking inherently benefits those closest to money creation. The data backs this up dramatically. Since 1971, since the end of the gold standard, wealth inequality in America and most developed countries has increased exponentially. In 1971, the top 1% of Americans owned about 24% of the nation's wealth. Today, they own over 40%. The wealth of the top 0.1% has increased even more dramatically. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans own less than 2% of national wealth, down from about 4% in 1971. The middle class, the backbone of American democracy, has been hollowed out. Look at asset prices versus wages since 1971. The S&P 500 stock index has increased by over 5,000%. Real estate prices in major cities have increased by 500 to 1,000%. The cost of college education has increased over 1,000%. Healthcare costs have exploded, but median wages adjusted for inflation have barely moved. A worker in 2024 has roughly the same purchasing power as a worker in 1973, despite massive increases in productivity. Where did the gains from productivity go? To capital, not labor. To those who own assets, not those who only have their labor to sell. This is not an accident. This is not a series of unfortunate policy mistakes. This is the fiat money system working as designed. When you can create money from nothing, those who control money creation and those closest to that creation extract wealth from everyone else. It's a silent tax. An invisible theft that happens gradually enough that most people don't notice or understand what's happening to them. They just know that life seems harder than it should be, that they're working longer hours for less real purchasing power, that the American dream of their parents' generation seems impossible to achieve. In 1970, a single income could support a middle-class family. A man with a high school education could get a factory job that paid enough to buy a house, own a car, support a wife and kids, and save for retirement. Today, dual incomes with college degrees often struggle to afford a modest home in a decent area. Is this because people today are less hardworking, less productive? No. Productivity has increased dramatically. Technology has made us far more efficient. The difference is monetary. The fiat money system has transferred wealth systematically from labor to capital, from the many to the few. After Nixon severed the link to gold, the United States needed a new anchor for the dollar. Something to ensure that global demand for dollars would continue. Something to make holding dollars necessary rather than optional. They found the answer in black gold: oil. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Arab members, imposed an oil embargo on the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled, gas stations ran dry, Americans waited in long lines for rationed gasoline. The embargo was a demonstration of how dependent the industrialized world had become on Middle Eastern oil, and how vulnerable that made the United States. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger saw opportunity in this crisis. In 1974, he brokered a series of agreements with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in OPEC. The deal was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, not in gold, not in a basket of currencies, only dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection to the Saudi kingdom, sell advanced weapons to the Saudi military, and support the regime diplomatically. Other OPEC nations soon followed Saudi Arabia's lead. The entire global oil trade would be conducted in dollars. This created what became known as the petrodollar system. Every country in the world needs oil. Oil powers transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, everything. To buy oil, you need dollars. This guaranteed permanent structural demand for US currency. It didn't matter if countries trusted the dollar or liked American policy. They had no choice. If they wanted oil, they needed dollars. This allowed the United States to run perpetual trade deficits without facing the consequences that would destroy other nations' currencies. When America imported more than it exported, dollars flowed out to other countries. But those countries needed to hold those dollars to buy oil. The dollars came back to America to buy treasury bonds, effectively lending the money back to the US government at low interest rates. It was a perfect system from America's perspective. Print dollars, buy real goods from other countries, and have those dollars return as loans to the US government. Exorbitant privilege indeed. But the system required enforcement. Oil had to be priced in dollars, or the whole arrangement collapsed. And when countries tried to break free from the petrodollar system, they faced severe consequences. The pattern is striking once you know to look for it. In 2000, Iraq's Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. He called it a strategic move away from the dollar. Iraq's oil sales to Europe would be conducted in European currency. At the time, this seemed like a minor policy decision, but it was a direct threat to the petrodollar system. If other oil producers followed Iraq's example, demand for dollars would decline, potentially triggering a dollar crisis. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official reasons were weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The terrorism links were tenuous at best, but one of the first things the new Iraqi government did was switch oil sales back to dollars. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi made a similar challenge to dollar dominance. In 2009, Gaddafi began advocating for a gold-backed African currency called the gold dinar. He wanted African and Muslim nations to use this currency for oil sales instead of dollars or euros. He had the gold reserves to make it credible and was using Libya's oil wealth to push the idea. He called it economic liberation from Western imperialism. In 2011, NATO intervened in Libya's civil war, backing rebels against Gaddafi. The intervention was officially about human rights and protecting civilians. But leaked emails from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton suggested that Gaddafi's gold dinar plan was a significant concern. Gaddafi was killed by rebels in October 2011. Libya descended into chaos. The gold dinar was never implemented. Perhaps these are coincidences. Perhaps the petrodollar had nothing to do with these military interventions. Perhaps the official explanations are complete and accurate. But the pattern is suggestive. Countries that threaten the dollar's role in oil trade seem to face regime change. Meanwhile, countries that maintain the petrodollar system, regardless of their human rights records or political systems, receive American support. Saudi Arabia's regime is hardly democratic, yet it remains America's closest Middle Eastern ally. The petrodollar is defended whatever the cost. Fast forward to 2008. The financial system that had been built on fiat currency and fractional reserve banking reached its logical conclusion. It collapsed. The seeds of the crisis were planted years earlier. In the early 2000s, interest rates were kept artificially low by the Federal Reserve. This made borrowing cheap and encouraged speculation. Banks began making increasingly risky loans. Subprime mortgages, loans to people with poor credit and insufficient income, became commonplace. Why would banks make loans they knew were risky? Because they didn't keep the loans, they sold them. Wall Street had developed a process called securitization. Banks would make thousands of mortgages, bundle them together, and sell the bundles as mortgage-backed securities to investors. The banks earned fees for making the loans and more fees for packaging and selling the securities. They had no incentive to ensure the loans were sound, because they wouldn't suffer if the loans defaulted. The investors buying the securities trusted the rating agencies, which gave even subprime mortgage bundles 8AA ratings, the highest possible rating reserved for the safest investments. The rating agencies were paid by the banks creating the securities. The conflict of interest was obvious, but everyone was making money, so no one cared. Banks took this further. They created derivatives of derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, synthetic CDOs, credit default swaps, financial instruments so complex that even the people creating them didn't fully understand them. The entire financial system became interconnected in opaque ways. Banks had exposure to other banks, which had exposure to insurance companies, which had exposure to pension funds. It was a house of cards of unimaginable complexity, built on the assumption that housing prices would always go up. When housing prices started falling in 2007, the house of cards began to collapse. Bear Stearns, a major investment bank, failed in March 2008 and was sold to JP Morgan Chase in a fire sale. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest and largest investment banks on Wall Street, filed for bankruptcy in September 2008. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history. The failure sent shockwaves through the global financial system. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped trusting each other. The commercial paper market, where companies get short-term loans to meet payroll and buy supplies, dried up. The entire financial system was on the verge of complete collapse. The Great Depression was about to repeat itself, possibly worse. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department responded with unprecedented interventions. They bailed out major banks with hundreds of billions of dollars. AIG, the insurance giant, received $182 billion. Citigroup got $476 billion in various forms of assistance. Bank of America received $336 billion. The numbers were staggering. Tax dollars going to rescue the very institutions whose reckless behavior had caused the crisis. The people who made millions in bonuses during the bubble kept their wealth. The executives who drove their companies into insolvency received golden parachutes. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans lost their homes, their jobs, their savings. But the bailouts were just the beginning. The Federal Reserve introduced a new policy tool called quantitative easing. The term sounds technical and boring, which is probably intentional. What it really means is creating massive amounts of new money and using it to buy financial assets. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve created over $3.7 trillion and used it to buy treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Let that sink in. $3.7 trillion created from nothing. The Fed's balance sheet, which had been under $1 trillion for its entire history, exploded to over $4 trillion. Where did this money go? To banks, primarily. The Fed bought bonds and securities from banks, giving them cash in exchange. The idea was that banks would use this cash to make loans to businesses and consumers, stimulating the economy. But banks didn't significantly increase lending. They kept much of the money as excess reserves or used it to buy stocks and other assets. The stock market recovered and then soared to record highs. Corporate profits increased. Executive compensation reached obscene levels. But the recovery for ordinary people was slow and painful. Unemployment remained high for years. Wages stagnated. Many people never recovered from the crisis. The European Central Bank followed America's lead, implementing its own quantitative easing program worth over 2.6 trillion euros. The Bank of Japan created over 90 trillion yen. The Bank of England created 445 billion pounds. Central banks worldwide printed over $15 trillion equivalent in the decade after 2008. This was unprecedented in scale. Never in human history had so much money been created so quickly. The experiment was ongoing. No one knew what the long-term consequences would be, but the short-term consequences were clear. Asset prices soared while wages stagnated. Wealth inequality reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Did your wages increase by the same percentage as the money supply? Of course not. The new money went to asset owners, to banks, to corporations. If you owned stocks, real estate or bonds, you got rich. The S&P 500 more than tripled between 2009 and 2019. Real estate in major cities doubled or tripled in value. But if you only had your labor to sell, if you worked for wages, your real purchasing power barely budged. The median household income in 2019, adjusted for inflation, was only slightly higher than in 1999. 2 decades of working, and the typical American family hadn't gotten ahead at all. Meanwhile, billionaires added trillions to their collective wealth. The Cantillon effect was operating on steroids. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, their wealth increased by tens of billions during this period. Not because they worked harder than everyone else, but because they owned assets that appreciated as central banks flooded the system with money. Amazon's stock price was driven up by cheap credit, allowing the company to expand aggressively, and by investors seeking returns in a zero interest rate environment. The wealth of the top 0.01% increased by over 400% between 2008 and 2020. The wealth of the bottom 50% increased by essentially zero. The system was working exactly as designed. Extract wealth from the many and concentrate it in the hands of the few. And then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic hit like a meteor. Governments around the world ordered businesses to close, people to stay home. The global economy essentially stopped. Millions of people lost their jobs overnight. Small businesses, built over decades, collapsed in weeks. The economic devastation was immediate and severe. Governments had to respond. People needed help. Businesses needed support. The question was how to pay for it. The answer, predictably, was print money. Lots of money. In the United States, Congress passed multiple stimulus bills totaling over $5 trillion. The CARES Act alone was $2.2 trillion. Stimulus checks went to most Americans. Enhanced unemployment benefits helped those who lost jobs. The Paycheck Protection Program gave loans to businesses. Much of this spending was necessary. People needed help. But the scale was incredible. In just 2 years, 2020 and 2021, the US government printed more money than had existed in the entire previous history of the country. More than during World War II, more than during the 2008 crisis, more than during all previous crises combined. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $4.2 trillion in March 2020 to nearly $9 trillion by mid-2022. They created almost $5 trillion in 2 years. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and other major central banks did similar things. Globally, central banks created over $20 trillion during the pandemic. It was the greatest monetary expansion in human history. The money printer went into hyperdrive. And the consequences? We're living them right now. Inflation returned with a vengeance. After decades of relatively low inflation, prices began rising rapidly in 2021. By 2022, inflation hit 9% in the United States, the highest in over 40 years. Food prices soared. Gas prices doubled. Housing became even more unaffordable. The cost of living crisis hit everyone, but especially those with lower incomes who spend most of their money on necessities. The Federal Reserve's response was to raise interest rates aggressively, causing stock market declines and fears of recession. The boom and bust cycle, driven by monetary manipulation, continued its destructive pattern. But here's the most infuriating part. While ordinary people struggled through lockdowns, job losses, and inflation, the wealthy got richer, much richer. Between March 2020 and March 2022, American billionaires collectively added over $1.7 trillion to their wealth. Elon Musk's wealth increased by over $200 billion. Jeff Bezos added over $70 billion. As small businesses died, Amazon's profits soared. As people stayed home, tech companies thrived. The pandemic was the greatest wealth transfer from the poor and middle class to the ultra-wealthy in modern history. And it was enabled by monetary policy, by the ability to print unlimited money. So where does this leave us? What is the future of this fiat money system built on nothing but faith and enforced by military and economic power? History provides some clues, and they're not encouraging. Fiat currencies have a perfect track record. They always fail, always. It's just a question of when and how. The Roman Empire debased its denarius by reducing the silver content over centuries. By the time Rome fell, the denarius was worthless. The French assignat, introduced during the French Revolution, collapsed into hyperinflation within a few years. The German papier mark we discussed earlier, destroyed in 1923. The list goes on and on. Economists have studied the lifespan of fiat currencies throughout history. The average is about 27 years, from when a currency becomes pure fiat to when it fails or is replaced. Some last longer, some collapse quickly. But eventually, the temptation to print becomes too strong. Governments always promise restraint, always promise that they'll be different, that they've learned from history. They never are. They never have. The printing press is too tempting. The ability to solve immediate political problems by creating money is too seductive. Discipline gives way to expediency. Restraint gives way to desperation. The US dollar has been a pure fiat currency since 1971. That's 53 years. It has already lasted longer than the average fiat currency. Does that mean it's immune to failure? That America has figured out something that eluded every previous empire? Or does it mean we're living on borrowed time, that the reckoning has been delayed but not avoided? The warning signs are multiplying. The national debt exceeds $33 trillion and grows by trillions every year. Interest payments on that debt now exceed spending on national defense. The debt grows faster than the economy. This is mathematically unsustainable. The Federal Reserve is trapped. If they keep interest rates high to fight inflation, they risk causing a recession and making the debt even harder to service. If they lower rates and print more money, inflation will return or worsen. They're trying to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis, between the monsters of inflation and deflation, with no good options. Every choice has severe consequences. This is the endgame of fiat currency. You print until you can't print anymore without destroying the currency's value. Then you either accept severe deflation and depression, or you print even more and risk hyperinflation. There is no easy exit. Some people are looking for alternatives to the fiat system. Bitcoin, created in 2009, was an explicit response to central bank money printing. Its anonymous creator, Satoshi Nakamoto, embedded in Bitcoin's first block a headline from that day's newspaper. Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. It was a statement. Bitcoin has a fixed supply cap of 21 million coins. No one can print more. No government can inflate it away. It's decentralized, with no Federal Reserve that can manipulate supply. Whether Bitcoin succeeds or fails as money, its existence and growing adoption prove something important. People are losing faith in fiat currency. They're searching for alternatives, for something that can't be debased by governments. Gold has returned to favor as well. Central banks, especially in China, Russia, and other countries wary of dollar dominance, have been accumulating gold reserves at the fastest pace in decades. Why would central banks buy gold if fiat currency is superior? Because they understand monetary history. They know that when crisis comes, when faith in paper fails, gold remains valuable. Gold is Plan B for when Plan A collapses. The fact that central banks are loading up on gold suggests they expect turbulent times ahead. Countries are also actively working to reduce dependence on the dollar. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have discussed creating alternative payment systems that bypass dollars. China has established currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing bilateral trade without converting to dollars. Russia and China settle much of their trade in rubles and yuan. Saudi Arabia, America's closest petrodollar partner, has discussed accepting yuan for oil sales to China. The petrodollar system is not what it once was. Cracks are forming in dollar hegemony. This doesn't mean the dollar will collapse tomorrow. The system has enormous inertia. The dollar is still by far the dominant reserve currency. Most international trade still uses dollars. Most commodities are still priced in dollars. The American military remains the world's strongest. But dominance is not permanent. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for over a century, until it wasn't. The Spanish real before that. Reserve currency status can end, often faster than people expect. When confidence breaks, when faith fails, the transition can be swift and brutal. What would dollar collapse look like? It depends on how it happens. A slow decline would see inflation gradually eroding purchasing power, the dollar losing its reserve currency status over decades, America's living standards declining relative to other countries. This might be manageable, though painful. A rapid collapse would be catastrophic. Hyperinflation, where prices double every few months or weeks. Savings wiped out. Pensions becoming worthless. Social security unable to buy basic necessities. Supply chains breaking down because no one trusts the currency. Possible social and political upheaval. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it's not certain, it's not impossible either. It's happened in many countries throughout history. America is not magically immune to the laws of economics. So what really happened when money stopped being gold and became paper? We traded tangible wealth for a promise. We traded the discipline of a gold standard for the flexibility of fiat currency. We were told this flexibility would allow better economic management, that enlightened central bankers would smooth out booms and busts, that we'd have prosperity without the constraints of gold. What we got instead was the greatest wealth transfer in human history. A system where those who understand how money works extract wealth from those who don't, where those close to money creation get rich, while those far from it see their purchasing power erode. The system benefits a small elite at the expense of the many. This is not conspiracy theory. This is observable fact. The data is clear. Wealth inequality has exploded since 1971. The middle class has been hollowed out. Social mobility has declined. The American dream, the idea that hard work and saving will lead to prosperity, has become a cruel joke for many. People work longer hours for less real purchasing power than their grandparents had. Two incomes barely achieve what one income easily provided 50 years ago. This is not because people are less productive or less hardworking. This is because the money itself is the problem. Those who understood the game adapted. They borrowed rather than saved because debt gets repaid with depreciated currency. They bought assets rather than holding cash because assets appreciate while currency depreciates. They learned to think like the wealthy, to leverage other people's money, to benefit from the Cantillon effect rather than being victimized by it. But most people didn't understand. They played by the old rules. Save money, work hard, be responsible, and they lost. Not because they were foolish, but because the rules had changed without anyone telling them. Can this system last? Can a currency backed by nothing but government promise and military power persist indefinitely? History says no. Every fiat currency has eventually failed. Every empire that printed money beyond its means has collapsed. The Romans, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, the list of failed fiat currencies is long and comprehensive. Why would America be different? What makes the dollar special? The only arguments are scale and military power. America is big. America is strong. But size and strength don't repeal economic laws. They just delay consequences. The bigger the empire, the harder the fall. The printing cannot continue forever. At some point, either foreign countries will lose faith and dump dollars, causing a currency crisis, or domestic inflation will become so severe that it destroys the economy from within, or the debt burden will become so massive that default becomes inevitable. The only question is timing. When will the music stop? When will this game of musical chairs end with not enough chairs for everyone? No one knows. It could be years. It could be decades. But it's coming. The mathematics are inexorable. The historical patterns are clear. This is the money upside down. The story of how the greatest economic power in history built its dominance on a foundation of paper and promises. How it convinced the world to accept currency backed by nothing but faith. How it enriched a small elite while impoverishing the many. How it created a system that cannot last but continues because no one knows how to end it without catastrophic consequences. The story is not over. We're living in the middle chapters. The ending has yet to be written. But if history is any guide, that ending will not be pretty. The only question is, who will suffer most when it comes, and whether anything better will rise from the ashes. The money in your pocket is not what you think it is. It's not wealth, it's not security. It's a claim on a system that grows more unstable by the day. Understanding this won't make you rich, but it might help you prepare for what's coming. Because something is coming. The bill for 50 years of printing is coming due, and when it does, those who understand money will survive. Those who don't will be swept away in the tide. Welcome to the upside-down world of modern money. Nothing is as it seems, and everything you thought you knew about wealth, savings, and prosperity is built on foundations of sand. This has been The Money Upside Down, Episode 1, The Creation of Money, the Pact that Changed the World. Next time we'll explore the inflation deception, how central banks steal your wealth while you sleep, and why the official inflation numbers are lies designed to keep you poor. Until then, question everything, especially money.